part, don't worry, it will be available. So let's get right back to Rob Natelson. Rob, President Obama yesterday, and this isn't the first time, number one, that he has criticized the Supreme Court, nor is it the first time that the President of the United States, a President of the United States, has had issues with the Supreme Court. It appears that there are some presidents who have thin skins when it comes to the Supreme Court. They don't like their laws being shot down. And President Obama had some harsh words yesterday saying, first of all, he thought that the Supreme Court would uphold his law, and that, too, essentially said, this is an unelected body. They certainly don't have the authority that I do as the elected president of the United States.
It's difficult to know where to begin with that statement. I mean, it was so full of errors. But let me start by saying that presidents who have been perceived as undercutting the independence of the Supreme Court generally have lost the battle. I mean, you point out many presidents have had problems with the Supreme Court. This dates back to Jefferson. Jefferson started, hoped to impeach members of the Supreme Court that he didn't like, and he was unsuccessful. And John Marshall, his opponent, remained Chief Justice long after Jefferson had left the presidency. Another famous example was Franklin Roosevelt's effort to pack the court. The Chief Justice at the time was a very able politician named Charles Evans Hughes, who in fact had been the Republican nominee for president in 1913. And Hughes thoroughly outmaneuvered Roosevelt, and Roosevelt came back with egg in his face. So it's a risky thing for the president to do politically. His statements are absurd to the level of being bizarre. I mean, he talks about Obamacare having been passed by strong majorities. In fact, the vote on the House of Representatives on Obamacare was 219 to 212. In other words, 7 votes out of over 400 cast. And in the Senate, they got just barely the 60 that they needed to get it out of the Senate. He said it would be unprecedented for the court to strike down.
Yeah, I thought that was odd, too. He said, and I want everybody to hear this. This is what the president said. Ultimately, I am confident that the Supreme Court will not take what would be an unprecedented, extraordinary step of overturning a law that was passed by a strong majority of a democratically elected Congress. I mean, it's sort of like, well, if Congress went out and passed a law that said all political parties other than its own would be outlawed, that somehow the Supreme Court would be wrong to take the step of declaring a law like that unconstitutional. It is bizarre. It's creepy.
Yeah, it's creepy. In fact, it would be their obligation to strike it down, wouldn't it? And one of the reasons the court is there is to provide a check against the passions of willful or temporary majorities. But he's just wrong on the claim that it's unprecedented. I mean, the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 was passed by margins of both houses of better than 4-1. And yet 3 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court struck it down. Or if you prefer a much more recent example, in 1994, Congress passed a bill called the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. It was passed by margins in the House of Representatives and Senate significantly in excess of those of Obamacare. And yet 6 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down part of it. That is what the Supreme Court's job is. But the biggest outrage in his comment was comparing the liberal activism that conservatives have complained about to striking down this law. They are different at so many levels. It's hard to know where even to begin.
Yeah, because that is the next thing that he says. You just brought up. Obama noted that this is an article on Yahoo News. Obama noted that for years conservatives had been arguing that the, quote, unelected Supreme Court should not adopt an activist approach by making rather than interpreting law, and held up the healthcare legislation as an example. Wait a second. They're not making law in this case. They're interpreting a law that has been passed by Congress.
Well, yeah, and a great comparison with striking down Obamacare is with a famous liberal activist decision, Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade, of course, is the 1973 decision that declared that abortion is legal nationally, and it's a decision that Obama supports. Well, if Obamacare is struck down, that means that one statute of Congress narrowly passed, a new statute that makes a new departure is struck down, and the status quo ante, in other words, the condition immediately before the law, remains. In the case of Roe versus Wade, which again President Obama supports, the Supreme Court struck down the democratically adopted laws of all 50 states, impacted the democratically enacted laws of Congress as well, seized enormous new power over the states because the judiciary then assumed the power to regulate regulate all kinds of laws that the states might adopt in the social area, and did so based upon a provision in the Constitution that had absolutely nothing to do with abortion, that was passed at a time when abortion was already illegal in most states and was never understood to affect abortion. You compare that particular decision, Roe versus Wade, which, as I said, the president supports, with a decision striking down Obamacare, which does nothing but blunt a new initiative by Congress and restores the immediate status quo as it existed before. There's no comparison. The other thing I might want to mention is that you can make an argument that upholding Obamacare in defiance of the Constitution is real judicial activism, because if Obamacare survives, that will greatly increase the power of the U.S. judiciary, because the federal judiciary will be able to decide all kinds of health care cases that they couldn't decide before Obamacare.
There's one more thing I want to address, and we'll do it after we come back from the break. This disturbs me as well. Well, everything about it disturbs me, so this is just another element that disturbs me. And this is from a man, Barack Obama, who was a constitutional law professor. It does leave me wondering what kind of constitutional law he taught. But I'm going to throw this out there, and then coming back from the break, Rob, if you could address it. President Obama, sure, according to Yahoo News, also argued that there was, quote, a human element to the healthcare battle, as well as legal and political dimensions. Is the role of the Supreme Court supposed to involve a human element? To me, what this means is anecdote, making law on anecdote, as opposed to, I guess, really the legal and the constitutional arguments. We'll get Rob Natelson's take on that in just a moment. Last break for the Amy Oliver Show. We'll wrap it up here with constitutional scholar Rob Natelson in just a moment. Eight minutes before the top of the hour. Thanks so much for tuning into the Amy Oliver Show on Colorado's original radio station. I want to thank one of my fabulous sponsors. For those of you wondering, how the heck have I been able to do Courage Classic the last couple of years, and I'm really jazzed to do it this year. I am so far ahead of my training, certainly much further ahead than I was 2 years ago, and I'm even further ahead than I was a year ago. And that's because of Take Shape for Life. Seriously, it's not just about losing the weight. It was about getting healthy. It's about it's about feeling great. And I'm going to share a story with all of you tomorrow about what I consider to be sort of an exciting development, and I'm not certain how it would have played out had I not gone on Take Shape for Life 2 years ago. I'd planned to lose 15 pounds, ended up losing 25, have kept it off for 2 years. It doesn't matter if you want to lose 15 pounds or 150 pounds. Take Shape for Life teaches you the habits of health. The hardest decision you'll make is the decision to go on Take Shape for Life. But once you do, you're going to be thankful that you did. Easy to find out more about the program by going to DamonSasso.com. Click on the link for the skinny. Again, DamonSasso.com. Click on the link for the skinny and find out more information. Of course, tell Damon that I sent you. All right, let's get right back to Rob Natelson. We'll wrap up the Amy Oliver Show with Rob's comments on Barack Obama really taking the Supreme Court to task yesterday in statements in the Rose Garden. This is another element of this that concerns me, Rob, is that the President of the United States is talking about the human element regarding the health care law. Now, that is the last thing I want the Supreme Court to look at is anecdote. I want them to look at the Constitution. I don't want them making law based on anecdote. We get ourselves into trouble with that.
Well, you know, Amy, the Constitution serves human values. That's why it's there. It's there to protect liberty and the general welfare and common defense and so forth.
But do you think that's the human element? Is that the human element Barack Obama wants the Supreme Court to consider?
Well, I don't know. I mean, probably not. The Supreme Court the Constitution lays down rules for protecting those human values, but the lawyers on the Supreme Court don't have any special expertise in doing anything but law. I mean, that's their specialty, and that's their job is to apply the law, which in turn embodies human values. You know, I have to point out that it takes a special type of person to take the court to task for possibly striking down a law that he claims was passed by strong majorities but wasn't, when he himself made the unilateral decision to effectively suspend the Defense of Marriage Act. Now, the Defense of Marriage Act was passed in 1996. The vote in the House of Representatives was 342 to 67. The vote in the Senate was even more lopsided, 85 to 14, and it was signed by a Democratic president, President Clinton. And yet, on his own say-so, he says, I think it's unconstitutional, and therefore I'm going to violate my oath of office to ensure that the laws be faithfully executed. And he complains about the Supreme Court reviewing a law.
Yeah, it really is. It's bizarre. It has this creep. His comments to me are creepy. And I wish that I felt like his idea of the human element when it comes to Obamacare actually entailed the human values that you so beautifully articulated that are contained within the Constitution. Problem is, he doesn't. There's nothing about how he has governed that indicate that's how he views the Constitution. And he is a hypocrite of the worst kind when it comes to this. And yet we're supposed to look at him and act as if, as if he's sincere. He's just not. It's creepy. I don't know how else to put it. It just gives me an ick factor.
You also made reference to him teaching constitutional law at the University of Chicago. I've looked at some of the course materials. He taught something called Constitutional Law 3, and then he taught a seminar called.
Rob, we only have about 10 seconds.
Well, the point is that he never really got involved in the structure of federalism or the foundation of the Constitution. He's mostly involved in trendy issues.
So that's our president who's talking constitutional law. Thanks, Rob. Everybody have a great day.
Kia North is Northern